Did you know that around 60 to 90% of all business acquisitions involve some form of seller financing? With that statistic, you'd think it would be easy to negotiate seller financing, wouldn't you? But without a clear structure to your negotiations, you may not even get past the first hurdle. So, what is that first hurdle? At what point should you even start discussing seller financing? Why would a seller agree to it in the first place? But then, who's actually responsible for repaying the seller financing loan? Obviously, we have some questions to answer. So let's get into it. If we're going to talk about negotiating seller financing, we first need to understand the basics of a negotiation itself. At its core, negotiation is simply a conversation between two or more parties aimed at creating an outcome that meets everyone's key interests. In this case, the two main parties are you, the buyer, and the owner, who is the seller. The outcome is the transfer of ownership of the business to you. And the agreement covers not just the price, but also how and when the price will be paid. Sounds obvious, right? But here's the truth about buying businesses. If you're using a bank loan, the only thing you typically get to negotiate is the price. The bank calls the shots on everything else: the deposit, the interest rate, the repayment period, and so on. And here's the hard fact. If you borrow from a bank, the seller gets 100% of the price up front on completion. Why does that matter? It matters because it's usually in your best interest to hold back as much of the price at completion as is reasonably possible. Why? For one, it shows the seller has confidence in the business they're handing over. But also it gives you leverage if unexpected liabilities pop up after the sale. You can offset them against what you still owe to the seller. That's where the real control comes in, where you're not left high and dry. So, once the price is set, the rest of the deal, especially the seller finance, is still very much on the table. Let's break this down into a simple 7-step process you can use to negotiate just about any seller financing deal. Step 1, build rapport. Rapport is the foundation of any good negotiation, but with seller financing, it's even more critical. After all, the seller is effectively lending you money to buy their business. Would you lend money to someone you don't trust? Probably not. I always tell my students who take my course on buying million-pound businesses, don't rush to ask about seller financing. Think of it like dating. You wouldn't propose marriage on the first date, would you? You need to spend time building rapport. But here's the thing, with rapport comes trust. So, how do you build rapport? By asking open-ended questions. Therefore, you make it all about the seller. Ask about their journey, their reason for selling, what matters to them. Not only does this build trust, but it also gives you valuable insights into their motivations. But remember, if the seller doesn't trust you, they may not even sell to you at all, let alone agree to seller financing. Step 2, buy a profitable, cash-flowing business. Here's the truth. Seller financing only works with good businesses. Forget the myth that seller financing is just for failing companies. Here's the thing. The repayments for seller financing come from the business's cash flows, not your personal bank account. Therefore, a dud business, which is one that's losing money, has declining sales, or is in a cash flow crisis, simply can't afford to repay the seller finance. As a rule of thumb, look for businesses with over £1 million in annual sales and at least £100,000 in profits. But the business also needs to have good cash flows too. On my journey to buy £1 million business, I negotiated to buy a kitchen extractor cleaning business that was on the market for £450,000. On paper, this business was profitable. The seller agreed to seller finance the deal. But here's what happened. During the due diligence, I discovered that the business was having significant cash flow problems. It hadn't paid its PAYE and VAT to HMRC for many months. Therefore, it had significant liabilities. Because of this, it would have been difficult to make this deal work using seller financing, especially at a buying price of £450,000. Which means your focus should be on motivated sellers, entrepreneurs selling their businesses because of life changes like retirement, health problems, and burnout, not because the business itself is falling apart. Step 3. Agree the upfront payment versus the balance. Once you've agreed the price, you need to figure out the split between how much does the seller need up front at completion and how much can be paid later through seller financing. Most sellers will say they want 100% up front, but your job is to uncover what they really need. Ask questions like, why are you selling? What will you do with the money? Do you have debts you need to clear? When you understand their true needs, you can tailor the structure creatively. Perhaps they only need enough upfront to cover debts, and the rest can come over time. But why would the seller not want to agree to seller financing? Because if they agree, it means they get to sell their business, right? And quickly, because there's no complicated bank forms to complete, there's no credit checks, and no computer to say no. It's just you and the seller agreeing on terms. That's it. Step 4. Set the term of the seller financing. Next, agree on the repayment period. Don't agree to just 3 years if the business's cash flows need 5 years. Negotiate 3 years, 5 years, or maybe even 7 or 10 years. It all depends on what the business can afford. Remember, it's the business that repays the seller finance, not you personally. It would be pointless to agree a seller financing loan that the business can't afford to repay, because if you did, you'd be setting yourself up to fail from the outset. Work out the business's cash flows, then set realistic repayments. Make sure to leave enough headroom to pay yourself too. Also, agree on the payment frequency, monthly, quarterly, annually, or even lump sums. I've included a link below in the description to a spreadsheet template that will do these calculations for you. Step 5. Negotiate the interest rate. Here's where you have an advantage over banks. With seller finance, you can negotiate the interest rate. The seller's alternative is typically putting the money in the bank, which may pay very little interest. So you can often offer a lower rate than a bank loan would charge, but still make it attractive to the seller. Step 6. Add special clauses. This is where the real creativity comes in. For example, no payments for 6 months whilst you stabilise the business post-takeover. Interest-only payments at first to build up cash reserves. Link payments to profit milestones or add earn-out clauses. Almost anything is negotiable as long as both sides agree and it's legal. Step 7. Write a heads of terms. Finally, draft a heads of terms document. But I suggest you do this when you're with the seller and draft the document together. This is a simple, non-binding summary of the key terms you and the seller have agreed, like the price, payment structure, seller financing terms, timeline, etc. This document makes life much easier for both solicitors. It will save you and the seller time and legal fees, as it's a document that both sides have agreed to. Your solicitor will be able to use the heads of terms document to draft the final contract.
Does seller financing work? Absolutely. For example, I recently oversaw a business that was sold for £1.6 million where the buyer paid just £75,000 up front. The balance was financed through seller financing. But here's the thing, the seller agreed to not charge interest on the loan. Try getting that kind of deal with a bank. The beauty of seller financing is flexibility. You can craft a deal that works for you, the seller, and the business without jumping through bank hoops. But importantly, you're not handing over all the cash up front, giving you extra protection. But here's the other takeaway about this deal. It came about because the buyer made a direct approach to the owner. If you want to learn more about buying a business off market, watch this next video.